Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Northshire Presents virtual event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person, event manager at Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York, here with my good friend and colleague, Davith Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester Center, Vermont. Before we get started, and I disappear momentarily, a couple of very quick notes. First of all, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. We really appreciate the incredible loyalty and support of customers like you. Northshire wouldn't still be here after the last couple of years without you. So thank you so much for that. And then second of all, Davith is going to be posting a link in the chat. He'll post it a few times throughout the course of the evening. It is a list of all of tonight's recommended titles, so you can follow along from home if you don't catch the title or anything about a book, and also for convenient ordering in the future. So please make generous use of that link. So I'm going to disappear for a moment so I can hand my computer over to Mike. And Davith, why don't you take things away?
Sure thing, Rachel. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. The Bookseller Book Chat is always one of our most popular and also one of the most fun virtual events that we do here. I'm going to sneak in a quick recommendation for a pre-order that's coming up real quick. And that's Claire Dederer's Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, coming out in April from Knopf. Claire Dederer is a memoirist, most known for as a memoirist, but this is a new book about what do you do with the art of monstrous men, and she loves it. Starts with Polanski and Woody Allen and all that. It's a great book. You'll be hearing more about it soon. All right. Well, our first recommender here is master bookseller in Saratoga, Mike Hare, who I can never quite understand how he's able to read so many books, and I'm very excited to hear about these tonight. Mike, why don't you take it away?
David, thanks very much. There are a lot of good books to read, and I'm happy to be here at the bookstore and happy to be here this evening speaking with all of you. The book that I have is called Freedom's Dominion, and the author is Jefferson Cowie. And this entire book, it's an American history book. It is set in one county in Alabama, Barber County, Alabama. And what the author does very effectively is he traces the concept of freedom and how this concept has been compromised and even perverted in many cases by those who want to use their freedom to suppress freedom for other individuals, primarily white Americans as opposed to Black, African American, also Native Americans. And what Cowie does very effectively, he focuses on 4 historical periods in the United States. The first is in the 1830s, which was the Trail of Tears when Andrew Jackson was president. Part of the Trail of Tears stretched through Alabama. It was the removal of the Creek tribe in that particular area, but other tribes as well, to places out west where they were going to be staying for a very long period of time. Of course, that never happened. And they wound up on reservations here, there, and everywhere throughout the country where they lost their rights that they had been promised to in the past. But much of this, or part of this anyway, happened in this particular county. The second area of history that he goes into great depth about is Reconstruction, which was 1865 to 1877. And of course, that's when the federal government came to try to make sure that the end of slavery was truly the end of slavery and not just something that kind of stayed the same, which is what happened later when Jim Crow came into place in the late 19th and early 20th century and through that. The third period is the New Deal period. And the southern individuals in Alabama, the dominant party was the Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party remained dominant there through the civil rights movement of the 1960s. However, the dominant party, the Democratic Party, isn't like the party we know today. The party then was geared toward poor white men, essentially, and then women in 1920 when women earned the right to vote. So that was the basis of the party of the Democrats at that time. The New Deal pumped a lot of money into the South. They liked that, but they didn't like the regulations. They didn't like to recognize that African Americans had equal rights. And the fourth phase of this book is the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And just coincidentally, George Wallace, who's a very well-known politician in the late 20th century, ran for president as independent in 1968 and carried 5 states. That was his home county. And he was a very pivotal figure, a very reactionary figure, and really the kind of individual that people would love or hate at that time. And what Cowie does very well in this book is talk about the Indian removal in the 1830s, Reconstruction in the 1870s, the New Deal in the 1930s, and then Wallace in the 60s. And what the folks advocating freedom were talking about was let us be free and keep the federal government off our backs. Don't let the federal government allow others besides us to be free. So that's the basis of the book, set in Alabama, but it could be the entire country. It's still going on today. If you watch the news any evening now with the critical race theory, and the term freedom is so vague. It's so everybody wants to be free. Everybody thinks everybody should be free, but maybe not always. So Cowie does a good job in tracing American history through those 4 periods that are still going on today. The second book is called Foster, and the author is Claire Keegan, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this author. She's become very popular in the last couple of years. She wrote a book called Small Things Like These, which is outstanding, and this is the same length. It's about 90 pages, and the entire plot of the book is a young girl in Ireland. She's with a fairly impoverished family in rural Ireland, and the family has one too many kids to take care of, so they send this girl off to live with her mother's relatives in another area not too far away in rural Ireland, who she had never met before. That's the book. There's nothing more to it than that, but it's got everything beyond that in terms of the themes. It talks about family, it talks about relationships, and it talks about the awakening of this young girl. The young girl narrates the book. We don't know how old she is. Maybe she's 9 or 10, just a young girl. And there's no big reveal. There's no big awareness that all of a sudden, wow, things are so much different. It's very subtle, and it moves at such a wonderful pace. There's a great deal of depth. The emotional depth is really incredible for such a small book. And after I read it, again, it's 90 pages. It's a very quick read. I wanted to read it again because I thought I missed a few things the first time, just in terms of the language, in terms of the girl's reactions. She goes to the well for water. She watches the cows. They go shopping a couple times. That's the plot. It seems so mundane, but the book itself is really extraordinary and critically acclaimed. As is Small Things Like These. I'd highly recommend Foster by Claire Keegan. The third book I have is called Rough Sleepers by Tracy Kidder. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Tracy Kidder. He's a well-known author. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Mountains Beyond Mountains a few years ago. He's probably in his 70s now. He's been writing for a long time. He's essentially a journalist, and but a very well journalist who goes into great depth with his subjects. And his subject in this book is Dr. Jim O'Connell. And Dr. O'Connell went to Harvard to become a doctor, want to take the traditional path, go to med school, and then be a surgeon in a prominent hospital in Boston or elsewhere. And for a year, he thought, well, I'll work with the homeless just to see, just as part of his routine at that point. He thought he would give it a try. And that 1 year turned into 40 years, roughly, working with the homeless. And the book is about Dr. O'Connell's work with the homeless in Boston. You get to know these people. Some of the people, the real names are used, some are not. Some of the stories are very uplifting, some are very tragic, but it's very real. And O'Connell is just a very real man. He was someone who decided, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to work nights. I'm going to work weekends. I'm going to be out with these people in the middle of the night. Not even these people. That's the wrong way to put it. He was out with these individuals. They're people that he respected, people that he tried to help. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did not. However, he made the effort, and still, I believe, is today. He's been doing it for years. And the book goes into great detail. Part of it is heartbreaking. Part of it is very inspirational that a person like this, Jim O'Connell, is in the world today to help people without making a big show of it. And even though this book does bring him to the spotlight, deservedly so. The next book I have is called Becoming FDR by Jonathan Darman. And tomorrow night, Rachel and I are excited that Jonathan Darman will be here in our bookstore here in Saratoga Springs tomorrow night to talk about this book. And it's a wonderful book. It's there are many books about Franklin Roosevelt, and this book deals with the personal crisis that made a president. That's the subtitle. And the personal crisis was the fact that he came down with polio when he was 39 years old. And before that, Roosevelt was a very successful politician. He was an assistant secretary of the Navy in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet. A lot of people don't know that he was the vice presidential nominee in 1920. James Cox was the Democratic Party presidential candidate in 1920. Roosevelt was his running mate. They lost to Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. So Roosevelt already climbed a very high ladder point in the Democratic Party at that point in the 20s. And with his wealth and his reputation and his name, his Theodore Roosevelt, of course, was his wife's father, uncle. There was a lot of pressure for him to continue to do well. Then he contracted polio. And what do you do now? What does Franklin Roosevelt do? Well, the first thing he wants to do is be able to walk again, to be able to get on his feet. And he tried and he tried and he tried like anybody would. A great deal of determination. Of course, that never worked. Okay, I can't walk, so can I get back into politics? And at that point, people would think, well, you're kind of crazy. Why, you can't even walk. How can you get back into politics? But of course, we know that he did. And the story is about how he was able to achieve that. And it's a very moving story. Roosevelt, before he contracted polio, very successful again, but he was somewhat flighty, maybe not flighty is the word, but he was somewhat more superficial. He didn't really have the degree of empathy that he developed, and he developed the empathy because of his own suffering, and that parlayed into his presidency when the Depression hit, and he was the ideal president to be able to be empathetic for millions of people in America who were suffering during the Great Depression. So again, tomorrow night, Jonathan Darman will be here in our Saratoga Springs store at 6 o'clock up here on the second floor, right behind where we are now in Rachel's office. So hope if you're free, you might enjoy. I'm looking forward to meeting him and attending this myself. My next book is called The Survivalist, and the author is Kishana Cauley, who I never heard of before, African-American writer from New York City. Very interesting book. It's about an African-American female attorney who's trying to climb the corporate ladder in New York City and kind of hitting some ceilings, not being able to get as high as she wanted to within the field. And she meets up with a boyfriend who is a coffee entrepreneur who goes to South America. He goes all over the world to get coffee beans, and he brings them back to his apartment. And his apartment is shared with two survivalists, two individuals, a man and a woman, both African-American as well. And these two individuals are building a bunker in the backyard. They're running guns. They're doing all of these things that this narrator had really nothing at all to do with before. So there's a real culture clash going on here between the very frustrating law office situation, working 60 hours, trying to get ahead, the competition, all the difficulties that were going on there. And these people, they're basically, dealing guns, breaking the law, and building a bunker in their backyard. So it's completely, the conflict is very, very sharp. And the novel is very sharp too. It's very funny in parts. Cauley herself was an attorney. She was a tax attorney, I think, or some sort of attorney in New York City. So she was speaking from experience, talking about what's going on in law offices in New York City. I wouldn't want to be there working in these law offices in New York City, and neither did this narrator. And that's why she kind of took this route away from that. But it's really a fascinating book, a little bit off the beaten path, at least for the books that I typically read. But I'm very glad that I did. So it's called The Survivalist by Kishana Cauley. And my last book, also set in New York City, excuse me, called The Sewing Girl's Tale. And this is a true story, and it's set in New York City in the summer of 1793. And the book is about a young woman. Her name is Sawyer, and she was a sewing girl. Lana Sawyer was her name, 17 years old, and she was propositioned by a man who said he was an attorney. He wasn't. He was well-to-do. He said he was well-to-do, and he was, and he basically raped her. It was basically a date rape book. And what this girl did in 1793 in New York City was move to press charges against the perpetrator, which even in this day and age doesn't always happen. But in that day and age, right after the Revolutionary War, it was unheard of for a woman to say, okay, I'm going to press charges against this individual. So that is what the book is about. This is a true story. And that's what the story is about, but it's not at all lurid. It's a very dense book, but it's very elegantly written. It's not a sensationalist book at all. It has a very, very moving literary theme. The story progresses very smoothly, not predictably because of all the surprising things that happen. And one thing that I found really kind of cool and interesting about it is that at that time in New York City, the population was about 40,000, which is about the same as the population in Saratoga Springs today. So the woman, after this incident happened, the man was still free for some time, and so was she. And she'd see him on the street. It's like living in Saratoga Springs. You know a lot of people, you don't know everybody, but there's a degree of familiarity with the folks that you see on the street, and they would kind of see each other now and then. And of course, he would pay no attention to her because he had what he wanted from her, and that was the end. But for her, it was not the end because she did go ahead and press charges. Alexander Hamilton makes an appearance later on in the book. There's a little map of New York City in the front of the book, And it's, the Battery, the Wall Street, that area is developed, but north of that, it's farmland, it's fields, and you look at New York City and over 200 years ago, and it's just so unrecognizable in terms of what it's like today. But I'd highly recommend The Sewing Girl's Tale. It came out last summer, still in hardcover. Even in the cover is very attractive too, I think, but it's an excellent book about an historical event that at least I was not familiar with. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. A great list of books. I really appreciate your time. Up next, we've got Cassidy Washburn, who's also joining us from Saratoga Springs. She is the web processor and school order specialist. And she reads some great sci-fi titles and horror and all kinds of stuff. Cassidy, tell us about what you've been reading.
All right, thank you so much. I'm very excited to share these titles with you all today. So the first one I want to recommend is Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. You may recognize this author because she is the author of the Atlas 6, which came out also a few months ago. Very, very popular. She originally started as a self-published author, and she's clearly just taking off because Tor Books has picked up all of her backlist and is basically republishing her, and she's just phenomenal. But this one, unlike the Atlas 6, this is not a fantasy or a science fiction. This is just a beautiful love story. This follows Reagan and Aldo, who are just two individuals who learn about like their own troubled hearts and how to heal, not only through each other and the love that they find with each other, but also through admitting that they may or may not need some medication for mood disorders that they may have. And it's just so beautiful the way that they are able to heal through each other. And Olivia Blake's, like, what I love about her is her writing in general. Like, even her acknowledgments in this had me in tears. I do cry often in books, but this one had me in tears, just the acknowledgments alone. So it's very, very beautiful. Olivia Blake herself has a mood disorder, so this is an Own Voices novel through her character of Reagan, and learning to maybe not use medication. This is not meant to be like self-prescriptive or anything like that, but it's just so beautiful the way that these two characters can heal and learn and grow through each other. So I do highly recommend. This is Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. I love all of her stuff. So the next one I have to recommend actually just published today, and I believe the store has some signed copies if you're a fan of this author. This is The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. Shannon Chakraborty is the author of the Davabad trilogy, starting with The City of Brass, which is incredible as well. This one is a pirate fantasy, and we don't get a lot of pirate fantasies lately, and I'm very, very excited to recommend this one because it is phenomenal. It follows a over 40-plus-year-old character, which we also don't see a lot of in fantasies. She's retired from the life of pirating and being a sea captain, and the main character is Amina Al-Sarafi, and it is her story. It kind of starts out with a scribe that wants to take down her biography and her life events. And so you are kind of getting her story through her own words and word of mouth. And it's just awesome. It's action packed. There's a mystery involved. There's sea monsters. There's demonic husbands and magical artifacts. The main plot of it is that Amina has to come back from life of retirement in order to help find a missing girl for a very, very rich family. So she's doing it for the money in order to provide for her own family. She gathers a crew to do so, and on the way, they find out that there's also this really dangerous artifact that could put her own family and her friends in jeopardy. But there's just so much going on in this. It's highly entertaining. I could not stop reading. Action-packed around every corner, and it's really, really funny too. So you will have a lot of laugh out loud moments in this. But you will fall in love with the characters. This is the first book in what I believe is a trilogy. So pick it up if you're into pirate fantasies or if you're ready for a just epic sea adventure. So again, that was The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. The next one that I have is, I'm going to say it, is probably one of my favorite books of all time at this moment. It's called Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chapeko. And this one kind of flew under the radar, not only for me, who does read a lot of fantasy and science fiction titles, but just in general. I don't see a lot of people talking about it, and that's a shame. You should pick it up. This is a vampire fantasy, which vampire fantasies are coming back, which is really awesome. This one is the first book in a planned trilogy, and it follows Remy Pendergast, who is a vampire hunter in this world. And in this world, there are also vampire courts. Some of them are trying to make peace with the humans and the vampire hunters, and Remy is one of them who wants to make peace with vampires as well. This one is so entertaining for anyone, really, but particularly if you're a fan of anime or manga. This is adult though, but I highly recommend it if you have a reader in your family or someone who loves anime, because it was like reading an anime. It was so action packed. This follows not only Remy, but while trying to make peace, a plague hits that turns humans and vampires into these like horrific monsters that are like nonstop attacking people and like can transform. Kind of think almost The Last of Us zombies, like just transforming into these crazy monsters. So not only are they trying to make peace, but they have to deal with this plague and who created it and things like that. So it's very, very fast paced. There's that little touch of mystery in it. It's action packed. It has everything you could want. It even has a touch of romance with polyamory. So if you're a fan of that, that's also in here as well. So again, that's Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chapeko. I highly recommend it. It's now one of my favorite books. The next one I want to talk about also came out today, and it's another very popular author. This is A Day of Fallen Night. As you can see, we do have some signed copies available, I believe, at both stores. But this is by Samantha Shannon. This is the author of Priory of the Orange Tree. So this is also set in the same world of Priory of the Orange Tree, but it is a standalone prequel. So it's set, I believe, like 300 to 500 years before the events of Priory. You do not need to read Priory first. You don't even have to read this one before you read Priory. That's what I love about it. She's going to have, I think, 5 of these. They're all standalones. This is an epic fantasy with dragons, with mystery, multiple POVs, and tons of amazing representation. And her writing is just amazing. It's so well done with the world building. Each POV, I believe there's at least 4 or 5 POVs. You will not be bored. I promise you. There's so much going on in this. There's a sapphic romance, multiple sapphic romances, and it's over 850 pages, and I finished it in 2 days, if that's saying something. I can read pretty fast, but I did not want to put it down. This one, I should probably tell you what it's about, but it is filled with dragons, and it is basically following these 3 main women, all from different parts of the world, that have to deal with this huge calamity that is happening throughout. And some of them can like speak to each other in their minds, and it's just all of them coming together to deal with this event that puts the entire world at risk. It's amazing. I loved it so much. So again, that was A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. And then another one I also think came out today. This is a YA title. So this is Delicious Monsters by Liesl Sambury. This is a YA horror / thriller. So this one is basically a haunted house story that has 2 POVs, main POVs, set 10 years apart from each other. One is following, the one in the past is following a 17-year-old girl who can see ghosts, and her mother moves her into her uncle's old home after the uncle passes away. And in that home, there's a lot of mystery. There's tons of ghosts in there, and her mother is very kind of closed off about what happened to her in the past. So we have to learn with the character everything that's going on. And then the other POV is set 10 years in the future, the present technically, and is following a 19-year-old ghost hunter who has her own podcast and her own channel, and she wants to go to this house to learn about the events that happened in the other POV. So you're getting what's going on at that point as well as in the present. So you're kind of getting all these pieces of information to complete the mystery all together. So it does deal with a lot of trauma, a lot of abuse, both physical and mental abuse, not only from parents, but racism is in this as well. So it deals with a lot of tough topics, but in a way that YA young adult readers can read and understand. And I thought it was just very, very well done. It deals with those topics in a wonderful way. And it has this cool kind of haunted house vibe going on. So again, this one is Delicious Monsters by Liesl Samberry, which just came out as well. And what a wonderful cover that is. It's very, very cool. And then the last one I have to talk about is another horror, but this one is adult, and that is Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. This one kind of caught me off guard. I didn't expect to like it as much as I did, and after finishing it, I kind of was wondering what I even read. I didn't know what to feel after finishing it. This is a haunted house story that follows a bunch of queer characters that are facing some horrific encounters of transphobia, homophobia, racism, and fascism all at once. And so a lot of tough topics. And the author themselves does a great job of it and does not hold back on any of this, though. So go into it just knowing that there's a lot of trigger warnings. Because they do not hold back on those details. What I loved about it is not only is it a horror and haunted house story at the center of it, but the ghost story parallels the real life, like horrific events that the main characters are facing. And you kind of have to look at it like, is this really happening? Are these ghosts real, or is it all they're manifesting it to deal with the trauma that they're facing? So it's a lot to deal with. It's mind bending. So go into it knowing that there are trigger warnings, but you won't regret it because it is definitely one you're going to be thinking about for a very, very long time. So again, that was Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. And that was the last book I had to recommend.
Thank you so much, Cassidy. Always a pleasure having you on, and a bunch of great titles there too. All right, well, next up and finally, we have James Case, who is the floor manager at our Manchester, Vermont location. James reads all kinds of books, sci-fi and fantasy, children's books, and literary fiction and home improvement books. And he'll be joining us just shortly. I know there's one on his list that is very high on my to-be read list, based on his recommendation. James, take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start kind of with, I have a couple of kids' books, and so I'll start with those, and then we'll get on to the adult books. The first one actually is, it's called, let's see if I can get a good picture of this, but it's called How to Eat a Book, and it's by Mrs. and Mr. McLeod, and it concerns 3 children, the Grunions, who are named Sheila, Gerald, and Geraldine. And at the beginning of it's a picture book. At the beginning, they do their best to try to eat a book, and are shocked when in fact the books eat them. And as it progresses along, they find themselves sort of spiraling down and down into these different books they've chosen. And it's just a wonderful little parable about reading, and really good for kids. I found it to be really enjoyable. It also has some stunning, they're probably a bit hard to see, but really stunning and beautiful artwork. A lot of it is done with cutouts. She tends to emphasize, or both authors tend to emphasize things with different colors. But a really wonderful book about reading and perfect for kids. And that's How to Eat a Book by Mrs. and Mr. McLeod. But really beautiful, very well done, and also very funny and clever. So highly recommended. The next book, and we're going up a little bit in age, is called Never Forgotten, and this is by Alejandro Algorta. And this one is a bit harder to explain. Technically, it's listed in our store and anywhere you look is a mid-child book. But I think there's a lot for it to offer adults even. And I got a ton out of this book. I was kind of shocked at how good it was. It's on a basic level, the plot is very straightforward. And it's not even much of a plot, to be totally honest. It's about a boy in Bogota in Colombia named Fabio, and he just forgets how to ride his bicycle. He wakes up one day and he's renowned throughout his neighborhood for being able to ride anywhere. And he goes out and he gets on his bike and he just falls over. And every time he gets on it, he just falls over and he can't ride it anymore. And he's so confused and disoriented by this entire thing that instead of going out with his friends, he basically just hides out into his house. And he spends a lot of time with his elderly neighbor because he's embarrassed and just really confused by what's happening and how he could somehow forget how to ride a bicycle when everyone's told him this is impossible. There's all these different themes about loss. There's ones about grief. A portion of the book deals with the nature of language and how it can lie and deceive, and also even what the nature of truth is. The neighbor he hangs out with refuses to believe in the sea after her late husband continually promised to take her there. And he dies before he can. And so she just concludes, and she tells Fabio this, that the sea is a lie, and basically extrapolates that into a general theory that anything outside her senses is a lie. So only what she can see or hear or touch can be believed. It's got a ton of really beautiful language, and it's really good at asking all of these questions without really providing any answers. Yeah, a really stunning book, and just like gorgeously written, like really beautiful language. And I'll read a tiny bit just because I really would recommend this even for adults. It's only about 90 pages. It's a quick read and it's just beautiful. But this is just like a little snapshot in which she's describing like Bogota. And it says, the neighborhood in which Fabio lived had always been full of dust. His mother would say it was because it was under construction. And because to create something, you have to destroy first. The dust was a memory of the things that were there before and which now waited to be turned into new things. Born of all its failed plans, Bogota was a monster made of dust with a hunger for more. Anna also says that Fabio's neighborhood used to be a town on the outskirts of the city, but the monster began to grow and ate the town and others that also became a part of it. The streets folded themselves against the skirts of a hill, and what was once expansive and illuminated turned narrower and darker. Though that was not the monster's fault. Those to blame were the people who had children, who in turn had more children. The blame belonged to people who didn't have enough with one family and needed 2 or 3. The blame was on the construction workers who, to be better construction workers, needed to practice and expand their own homes. And the writing is just fantastic. It's just a wonderful book. It's one I randomly picked up and I opened it and I read like the first page and then 3 hours later it was finished. But really gorgeous, really beautiful, highly recommended. That's Never Forgotten by Alejandro Algorta. And it's also, just to say, it's a really beautiful edition. It has all these little black and white charcoal drawings in between. And it's also printed in both Spanish and English. So as you flip the book over, there's a Spanish version comprising half the book and an English verse or version comprising the other half. But excellent, highly recommended, both for kids and even for adults, because there was a lot there that I got out of the book, just so much. The next book I want to talk about is also a mid-child book. It's called Rat Rule 79 by Rivka Galchen. If you don't know Rivka Galchen, she's written a bunch of adult books as well. She's hilarious. Some of them, she wrote Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, which is a really great book. She also wrote one called Little Labors that's all about having children. That's also really funny. This is a book for kids, so for 8 to 12 about. And it's about a girl who is just about to turn 13, and she's upset because her mother is constantly brought her. They've constantly moved. Her mother constantly changes jobs. They constantly change cities. And so it's the eve of her 13th birthday and she's upset and she locks herself in her bedroom. But when she comes out, she realizes her mother has disappeared. into this strange place called the realm of impossibility. And so the main character, whose name is Fred, decides to follow her mother into there. And so this entire plot then is her trying to track down her mother in the realm of impossibility. And Galchen does a ton of things with wordplay. She's constantly playing with language and the ridiculousness of language. She takes common phrases at face value. She uses turns of phrase and puns constantly. One of the main characters is literally an elephant in the room that everyone ignores. There's people who don't want anyone to visit have unwelcome mats outside their door. There's a know-it owl. It's ridiculous and wonderful. And I honestly might have laughed more reading this book than I have anything else, period. I've been really lucky to read a bunch of great books in the last couple months. And this was definitely one of them. But laugh out loud funny, absolutely wonderful. In some ways reminds me a little of books maybe like Phantom Tollbooth, but it's got a character and a writing style all its own. But yeah, Rat Roll 79 is an amazing book. And there's just another look at it. So I loved it to death. Okay, now we'll move on to some adult books. I recently read the new novel by Guy Gabriel Kay, who is a Canadian fantasy writer. He's written a lot of works. He's been around for a long time. And I'd kind of taken a gap or a break from reading him. It had been a little while. Not for any real reason, but just because I hadn't thought of his books or come across a new one or paid too much attention to what he was writing. But I was very happy to pick up this one. And he's definitely an excellent author. It revolves around two characters. But as most of his books are, it's this enormous sort of sprawling epic. It's really almost about the time they find themselves in and how they get wrapped up in all the monumentous events of their world. And so as much as it's a portrait of these two people, it's also about all the like major characters and almost honestly like the more impactful and important people who surround them. And he also does, it's really interesting even how he writes, because instead of focusing on the action, which I think most novels, especially fantasy novels, that's what they do. It's all about sort of these high tension areas. He'll give them like 2 sentences, and all he's really interested in is all the decision making the characters have. So it's everything leading up to this big monumental moment that he spends all his time on. It's about how the characters are, like why they are who they are, and how they come to make these decisions, and the background to all this decision making. And the results of those, he goes over them because they impact the world and they impact these people. But it's a secondary interest. He's just much more interested in why the people are doing this, and what's happened to them before in their lives that caused them to act the way they act. This particular book has a lot of themes of exile. Both characters are exiles. Neither of them has been back to the land they grew up with, and they don't return, honestly, for the entire length of the novel. And so both of them are really trying to find their place in the world. And it just happens to end up through this giant confluence of events that part of it outside of their control, that it ends up being a very prominent place in this world that Guy Gabriel Kay creates. But it's a really beautiful book. It's incredibly written. I love that it's just in the sense of what he's concerned with, that it's a non-traditional fantasy, because it's not about the action, and it's much more about these characters, and you really do fall in love with them. And it turns into something where I feel like a lot of fantasy novels, there's so much action that the slightest, like, even though it's so over the top, it almost loses value. Where in this book, I think there was a phrase, like a small section where someone got slapped, and it was like a thunderclap. It was like the most monumental thing that happened in the entire book. I had to like put it back down to process it. But just an amazing book, and very well done. All right, so, and that was, once again, that was Guy Gabriel Kay, All the Seas of the World. And I think it's coming out in paperback pretty soon. So, but this is still in hardcover at the moment. The last book I want to talk about is called Our Share of Night, and this is by Mariana Enriquez. And this will very likely be, unless I read something better, which at this point seems so far-fetched, this is almost undoubtedly going to be my favorite book of the year. It was incredible. It's horror, but I almost hate lumping it into an own category because there's so much going on. It has so much to offer beyond like just scariness, though it's terrifying. I mean, it's an incredibly intense book. But essentially, it follows a father and son who are trying to distance themselves from a cult that's run essentially by their extended family. And the father's trying to protect the son, but also trying to keep him, I guess, screened or sheltered from everything that's been going on. And so he's terrible at communicating. And the son grows up confused and disoriented and goes through all this trauma without really understanding why it's happening. And meanwhile, like, the father's motives are always called into question, but there's this background as well, because they delve into so many characters that the reader sort of understands a little better, at least partially, what he's trying to do. Though even so, there's points where you really hate him, and that's true of a lot of the characters. I mean, it's shocking this book was so hard to put down because there are so many characters who are really despicable. But it's such an incredible portrait of these people, and also of it takes place in Argentina, and it's just also a remarkable portrait of like the country during this time, because it's during the dictatorship, and a lot of it is dealing with both like this family trauma, which is a major part of the book, but also this cultural trauma that this entire country is trying to come to grips with. And so certainly there's plenty of horror elements. I mean, there are things, there's supernatural parts. There's that basically says there's tons of supernatural. But really, I feel like the bulk of the book is much more just about these people. And I think that's what carries it. It was just incredible. Sometimes I have almost a hard time talking about it. I picked it up, I think, randomly and read the first couple pages, and then it was another book. I finished it, and it's not short. It's like 600 pages. I read it in, I think, 3 or 4 days. It had just so much to offer. But I will say it was just incredibly intense. It is not a light read. There is so much going on, and there's a lot of violence. There's an incredible amount of trauma and all sorts of trauma. Like I said, family trauma, cultural trauma, and that's like the essence of this book. But the author's so masterful, and the language is so well done that it just sucks you in and leaves you so much to think about. I mean, it was a book where I finished it and I just sat in a chair and just had to like process for 30 minutes after it was done. And I mean, I'm still thinking about it today. There's a really wonderful write-up actually in the New York Times that I'd encourage anybody to go check out, because they also reviewed it. But like I said, if I read a better book than that this year, I will count myself very, very lucky. So yeah, another incredible book. And that's all I got.
Thank you so much, James. Our Share of Night has really gotten to the top of my list here. And next up, we've got a few titles that Rachel is going to share with us. Rachel, go ahead, please.
Yes, we wrapped up with a few minutes to spare, so I'm jumping in. You won't find these on the blog post yet, though Davith will be adding them on tomorrow morning, so don't worry. But I will hold them up for a good long time so you can see them pretty well. I've been spending a lot of time on the children's floor here in the store lately, helping out. And one of the joys of that is picture books, which arrive and we get to see. So here are a few picture books that have come out recently that I really love. So the first one is Today is a Me Day by Evie Starkey. This is definitely, all three of these I would say are older picture books, so they're not for babies or toddlers, they're more for sort of preschoolers and early elementary schoolers. So Today is a Me Day is an incredibly sweet and gentle self-care book. There may be adults in your life who needed this book. I have to admit, I kind of did when it came in. But it's a girl going through doing special things on her day. She has all these things to do, but today she's going to find her yellow hat, lick the honey spoon. I mean, who doesn't need to do that? And it goes through all of the things that she's going today, and then tomorrow she will take over the world. And it is just a delight, beautiful. I was worried when it came in, actually. I thought, oh, I love this. This is beautiful. Will kids like it? And I read it at our Friday story time, and the kids did, in fact, like it. So this is one that works for adults and children. Today is a Me Day by E.V. Starkey. Next up is one that we actually got to do a virtual school visit for. So this was really special. Evergreen by Matthew Cordell. He won the Caldecott Medal a few years back for Wolf and Snow. He's a tremendous artist, a tremendous writer. And we were able to bring him virtually to a whole bunch of schools throughout the area to talk about this new picture book, which just came out, which is the adventures of little Evergreen, the timid squirrel, who's traversing the woods to bring soup to her granny. So some aspects of Little Red Riding Hood. It's a longer picture book than is typical. It's actually broken up into chapters. And in each chapter, she has some sort of adventure with an animal who is perhaps not what they seem like they're going to be. So there's a scary falcon who is not so scary. There's a sweet bunny who is maybe a little bit aggressive. The art is just delightful. I'm going to show you some of this art. It almost has the feel of like the Frog and Toad books in its sweetness. Also incredibly cool. This is something that I was super excited to discover. Underneath the dust jacket on the book itself is a map of Buckthorn Forest. And so all the places that Evergreen travels are shown on this map on the book, which I just think is tremendously cool. But it's also a very sweet children's book about finding your courage and finding the courage to go out into the world and have adventures. So that is Evergreen by Caldecott medalist Matthew Cordell. And I'll hold that up one more time as soon as I get the dust jacket back on. There, so Evergreen. And then the last one I would like to finish up with is a very sweet one by John J. Muth, Stillwater and Coo Save the World. So people might know John J. Muth from his Zen shorts. He writes really lovely picture books that are often inspired by Zen Buddhism. And Stillwater and Coo Save the World. The younger panda bear wakes up one morning and wants to save the world. And the parent figure in the book coaches, I think it's Stillwater is the little one, I can't remember for sure, coaches him through, well, we can't fix everything, but what are the little things that we can do? What are little kindnesses that we can do? And together they save the world. They don't save the whole world. They bring a cake to their neighbors. They feed the dog. They clean their room so it's tidier. They help some ducklings cross the road safely. So they're saving little pieces of it. And so it's just a beautiful philosophy for, again, children, which they really need to learn, and also for adults. It's one of those lessons that is really universal. So it ends with, oh, Stillwater's the adult. I'm sorry, I misremember that. Stillwater smiled. My big-hearted Coo, you did so many things today that made the world a better place. Each time you do something good, you save the world a little bit, said Stillwater, and you will do a little bit more tomorrow. And so I just love this. It's not preachy, it's gentle and sweet. And again, I read it at story time. It was a big hit with the kids there. But it's a really valuable lesson that all of us could learn. So that is Stillwater and Coo Save the World by John J. Muth. And that is my little mini list that I got to throw on there today.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And this has been another delightful evening. And you can find all the books tonight on the blog, and we'll be posting a recording of this event soon. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you at another virtual event sometime soon.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.